Mark 4, verses 35 through 41, a story that we all know very well. And the same day, when the even was come, he said unto them, Let us pass over unto the other side. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him, even as he was, in the ship. And there were also with him other little ships. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves began to beat the ship, and so it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they awake him, and say unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And he arose and rebuked the wind, and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. And he said unto them, Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said to one another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Jesus asks his disciples, How is it that you have no faith? He doesn't say a little bit of faith. He said, Well, how is it that you have no faith? Interesting. Obviously the disciples did have faith. They did. But having faith today doesn't mean that it will be there tomorrow. Having strong faith in the past doesn't mean that it is there at certain dire moments. We have to be aware at any time. Even the strongest believer can have moments of weakness and has moments of weakness. And here we read that they were sailing out at even. That means it was getting dark. So they were now in the middle of the lake. It was dark. The wind was rushing. The waves were pounding the ship. Obviously a wooden ship. You can imagine the wood, the sound of the wood that was squeaking and making all these noises. They were sure that it was the end of it. And fear overtook them. And so they awoke Jesus, as it says, in great fear and in haste. And with that they showed three things. Impatience. Under pressure of the elements, they were impatient. They didn't wait until Jesus would wake up by himself. They awoke him. And also unbelief. They showed unbelief. They had forgotten who Jesus was. They had already seen miracles that Jesus had done, healings that he had done. They knew, at least to a certain extent, of his power. But now all that was gone. All they could think of is, we perish. And the third thing is distrust. They didn't trust the Lord's care. When they wake him up, they say, Carest thou not that we perish? Eh? Don't you care that we are dying? They were actually not trusting his care. And you might say, okay, but it's understandable. Actually not, because Jesus had never, for even a second, shown that he didn't care about them. On the contrary, he was full of care. So they confused Jesus' calmness with him not caring. And that is something we often do. But calmness is not the same as not caring, as we will see. Now you can also speak to their defense. And as humans we often try to find excuses. So let me try to find excuses for the disciples' sake. They called on Jesus. They could also have tried to fix it themselves, or I don't know what, but they called on Jesus. At least they had faith that he was able to do something. of all of them. He was the one sleeping. Let's wake him up, and he can do something probably. The situation was also dire, because it says the ship was full. It means it was filling with water. So it was really, really a big threat that something bad was going to happen. And another detail that we read here is that they were not alone on the lake. It says in verse 36, there were also with him other little ships. So there were more boats, and they are called little. So they were apparently smaller than the boat that they were in. So we could maybe think that they were also caring about them, because if they were already in trouble and then their big ship was filling with water, what about these smaller boats? They must have been in greater trouble. So when they say we perish, who is the we? Are they really talking personally about themselves or about the whole group of boats that they were with? Maybe they were also caring about the others. Now I say this to their defense. At the same time I know it's not really so, because Jesus says, how is it that you have no faith? So if these were their motives, Jesus would not have said this. He would have praised them for their care for the others. But it also shows something, that when we are in a storm in our lives, and we think we are going to perish, we are going down, and we call upon the Lord, it's also something to think of, that there are others that have even smaller faith. They are smaller boats, and they are in the same storm, or sometimes even worse storms. And we often forget them. We think only of us. We are perishing, but others are also in the same boat, or in even smaller boat. So do we think of them? What example are we to them? If we, as let's say strong believers, are only thinking of ourselves, what example are we? So the question is, why were they afraid? They had seen proof of Jesus' power. They have seen proof of his care, his love. And so the fact to think that Jesus would just let this happen, why? Well, it's all because of fear. Fear has a very bad effect on man's memory. You forget what you know, you forget your past experiences. I have to think now of military training. My brother told me this when he was in the special forces. They had to go, I think I told it before, but they had to go in a cage with 5 men, fairly small cage, like the size of an elevator, and they were let down in the water. And in the top of the cage was an opening, but so small only one man can go through at a time. So they were let down without obviously any gear to breathe under the water. And at a certain signal, when a light would flash, they were allowed to get out, and not before that. So they would keep them underwater for like a minute or so, when you really begin to have a bit of trouble. Then the signal would be given and they would have to get out, but they would have to get out one by one. So if anyone would panic and force himself to the hole, he would block the hole and the whole team would die. So they would do this training time and again to train them not to panic in this kind of situations, to stay calm and to do what they are taught, to go one by one, and they would all be safe. But they had to train this many times, because once there is a real dangerous situation, we forget all these things, and we just do, we act on instinct, and it's not always working out well. So it has a bad effect on memory, fear. And also to think of what we talked about last week, about being in distress. They were in distress, and distress in Hebrew it's tzara, the root word, and it literally means to be in a narrow space. And being on a ship in distress, this fits very well. If you're on a boat and the waters are calm and it is nice weather, it's beautiful. You float on the rhythm of the waves, and you have this nice view, and you feel on the top of the world. But if that same boat gets in a storm, then you feel in a very small space. There's nowhere to go. There's literally nowhere to go. You hold on to the ship, but the ship itself is ready to go down. I had to think also of this scene of this movie, The Titanic, where at some point they are on the front of the ship, leaning on the railing, arms wide, and it's beautiful, and you feel really, the king of the world. But not long thereafter, the same ship was going down, and even this big ship, Titanic, one of the biggest ships, becomes a very narrow space at that moment. You're really in tzara, in distress, and what you need is to be put in a wide space, and the word for that in Hebrew is yasha. That is, add one letter, you have Yeshua. That is deliverance. He puts you in a wide space. So, same we see here in this story. Fear overtook the wind, the waves, the cold water, the darkness. It was overwhelming, and you feel very small as a human being. There's nothing you can do, and you only think of this is the end. And this is typical for most believers. Most believers, we are like this one on the front of the Titanic, arms wide, and we feel all great. But when the storm comes, it's a whole different piece of cake. All these beautiful words and songs and everything, it's away, forgotten, and there is only fear, panic. And there are these storms: loss of income, sickness, death of a dear one, persecution, disaster. There are many things that can happen in our lives that can be likened to a storm. And it will bring about fear that we didn't even know that it was inside of us. So the faith appears to be weak. All this confidence, this peace, this hope, this calmness, it's gone. There's only fear and doubt. The strongest believer is still very weak and full of shortcomings. Strong, saving faith is not always there, and especially when we need it most. And so we have to be like these special forces. We have to train all the time. And one way of training is being the Word. Reading stories like this, that's part of the training. Often we tend to think, no, we are not like that. We are not. If we would be on the boat, we would just say a prayer and be calm. Well, no. In Ecclesiastes 7, verse 20, it says, we've read this also often, there is not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. So we should not think that we are better or we are good and we would not stumble in a storm. And in James 3 verse 2, Jacobus, it says, in many things we offend all. King James language. It means we all make many mistakes. That's basically what it means. We all make many mistakes. No one of us is excluded from that. And we have great examples in the Bible. Hebrews 11 speaks about those great men of great faith, I would say, that we find in Scripture, and they all have had their moments of great fear when they forgot all about their God. For example, it says that Abram went in faith out of his country to a land that he didn't know. His faith was very strong. He trusted God. He took his whole possession with him and he went. He obeyed. But then, when fear struck, he lied about Sarah, told that she was his sister. He forgot about this same God that led him out of the land that he trusted so well, and he tried to figure out his own way to get out of the situation. Fear is very bad on our memories. He was a man of great faith, but he had also great shortcomings. And of course, King David is another example. As a teenager, he ran full of faith towards Goliath with his slingshot, and also later when he was running for King Saul, he was living in caves and things like that, but he believed that God would follow up on his promise that he would become king one day. His faith was strong. But then at some other point, in 1 Samuel 27, he says exactly the same the disciples say when they are on the boat in the storm. 1 Samuel. And David said in his heart, I shall now perish. One day by the hand of Saul, I shall perish. The same the disciples said, we shall perish. It was fear. He was sure he was going to die. And in 1 Samuel 21, we read a similar thing. Verse 10 says, and David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul. He fled for fear of Saul. He didn't flee because God told him to flee. He fled out of fear. Doesn't mean God wasn't with him, but this was the reason why he was fleeing. Fear. And he went to Achish, the king of Gath, and then you read a little bit further down in verse 12, and David laid up these words in his heart and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. He was sore afraid. He was very, very afraid. And actually we know because then he feigns himself to be a madman. So he loses all his dignity and everything out of fear. He has totally forgotten about the same God that gave him this confidence to go against Goliath when he was this baby believer. And he was only 17 around that time. So, yet, in spite of all this, he was a man after God's own heart. He was the apple of God's eye. So, these are men of great fear, but they also have them of great faith. And they have their moments of great fear when they forget all about it. So, if we think we are better, then we don't know our own heart. We don't know our own heart. And we would really be surprised at the weakness that might appear when the circumstances call for it. And there are many examples also in times of war where people quickly betray their neighbors to save their own lives. And fear has a very strange effect on people. So your current faith is no guarantee of what happens when such a trial might come. And it comes maybe when we feel at the peak of our faith. We talked about this also, I think yesterday or the day before. You had the moments that you think, I feel great, I'm strong in the Lord, and you feel so well, and these are often the moments you're on the highest, so you fall the hardest. And things can change very rapidly. We see something similar. We also talked about this yesterday, I think, about Hezekiah, the king Hezekiah, in 2 Chronicles 32. 2 Chronicles 32, verse 31. It says there, howbeit in the business of the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon, these were all the people that were visiting Hezekiah to look at the great things he had achieved. How is it in the business of the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon who sent unto him to inquire of the wonder that was done in the land, God left him. That's Hezekiah. Why? To try him, that he might know all that was in his heart. And this is what I meant before. If we think we are not prone to these kind of fears and the reaction on fear, then we don't know our heart. Hezekiah didn't know his heart. He thought he was very good, also very good with the Lord. For example, in 2 Kings 20, or you might also go to Isaiah 38, it's the same text. But 2 Kings 20, in verse, begins in verse 1, it says, in those days was Hezekiah sick unto death. So here he is basically at the end of his life, he's sick unto death, he's dying. And Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, came to him and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. Now this is grace. He walked well with the Lord, let's say. I put this between quotation marks, and he is about to die, and he gets a message from the prophet, you will die, get your house in order. Well, that's grace, that he gets this time to get right with whatever he has to get right with. But then it says, he turns his face to the wall and prayed unto the Lord, saying, I beseech thee, O Lord, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart. He is pleading to the Lord, don't let me die. I have a perfect heart. Don't you remember how good I was with you? I have done that which is good in thy sight. And he was weeping sore. He didn't know his heart. He didn't know his, and God did. And that's why this happened to him. And this prayer that he does happens while Isaiah is just walking away. And it says then in verse 4, it came to pass, before Isaiah was gone out of the middle court, that the word of the Lord came to him, saying, turn again. So before Isaiah had left the house, God says, go back. I heard this prayer, tell him he will live. I will give him another 15 years. And so he lives another 15 years, but then the truth of his heart comes out, and he turns away from God. And so you see the importance that we get to know ourselves, our own hearts, and not live in this fuzzy cloud where everything seems right. Because when the end comes before we can get right with the Lord, it's too late, obviously. Hezekiah got the chance, but he forsook it. So that does, of course, not mean that we have an excuse for error and for sinning, that we can say, well, our hearts are weak, we are human beings, so what can we do? No. It's not an excuse, and it may be something we cannot fix, but God can fix it. So we should not be discouraged by our own weakness. When we stumble, when we fall, we should not be discouraged, we should turn to Him. And that the disciples did right. They turned to Jesus in distress. That was good, at least. And that's why Jesus obviously answered their prayer. Jesus' disciples, they were true disciples, but they were also men. They had fears. And as long as we are in the body, fear can overwhelm us, and it can even overshadow our faith. So this is also something we should have in mind, and this, I have to think again of these little ships that were with them. When we see a brother or sister who is overcome with unbelief because of fear, maybe because of sickness or other things that happen in his or her life, we must not conclude too fast that this person has no faith. But the fear will overshadow it. And these are the moments to pray for each other, obviously. It's like gold. Gold might have dross, but you don't throw it away because it has dross. You refine it. It's valuable. You don't throw it away. And it's the same with us as believers. We have lots of dross, but still we are valuable in God's eyes, and He wants to refine us. And the refining goes by fire. It's not always a pleasant process. Now back to our story. Jesus doesn't say so much here. As soon as they're on the ship, all we know is that He was sleeping on a pillow. But then when they awake Him, He speaks to the wind and the waves, and He speaks to His disciples. He says less to the wind and the waves than He says to His disciples. And the effect is also opposite of the amount of words. Because to the sea He says only peace, be still. And that might have been one word actually in the language He spoke. So that's all. And what does the wind do? It obeys. It obeys. Jesus has authority over nature. And of course we know this God had parted the Red Sea. God had stopped the flow of the river Jordan when Joshua and the Israelites crossed it to enter the promised land. And it was at the season when the river was flowing the strongest. So these are just two examples of the many that we have, that God is in full control of nature and nature obeys God. Nature obeys God. The problem is man and man's heart. The disciples then, what is the effect of what Jesus says to the disciples? In verse 41 of Mark 4, it says, and they were feared exceedingly. In other words, they were even more afraid. So you would think that's strange. Now the sea is calm, they're more afraid. But this is not the same fear. This is not the same fear. Before they had fear to perish. Now they have fear of the Lord. Fear of God. They see the power of Jesus. The power of God. That's why they say, what man is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? This is the right fear. This is the type of fear we should have. Fear of the Lord. That's not this fear that brings you in distress, but it's fear that fills you with deep respect. It's a good type of fear. And these are often mixed up. In 2 Timothy 1 verse 7 it says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of truth and sound mind. So he doesn't give the spirit of fear. But at the same time in Job 28, verse 28, it says fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom, or is wisdom. So you put these things next to each other, you think this contradicts each other. But these are the two different types of fear. What is written to Timothy by Paul is this fear that the disciples had to perish. What is written in Job is this fear, this deep respect of the Lord and this of his power. That is a different type of fear. The fear that they first had is fear that comes in place of faith. When fear, this fear to perish or to go down, when this fear is strong, faith is gone. We see it in the example of King David, for example, that we looked at before. And when faith is strong, that fear is not there. Fear is gone. But the fear of the Lord, that is what strengthens your faith. So what we see with the disciples, when they say, when it says that they feared exceedingly, that actually shows that their faith had grown. This test had strengthened their faith in the Lord. And so this is part of the refining that we go through. We can go through very dire storms in our lives, but they are meant to strengthen our faith, not to bring us down. So we have to look at it from a spiritual perspective, not from a physical perspective. Now in the parallel gospel in Matthew 8, in verse 26, it's worded a little bit different. It says there that, the second half, it says, then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea. So he rebukes the wind. This is what he does. He rebukes it, and the wind and the sea obeys. But before that it says that he said to the disciples, why are you fearful, O you of little faith? So he rebukes the wind, but he doesn't rebuke his disciples. Actually, also in the Gospel of Mark, we see that he asks them a question, but he doesn't really rebuke them so much. He's not angry with them. He's not frustrated. He could have been. Certainly as a man, he was very tired, and they woke him up from his rest. He could have been angry. But he was not. Before he was calm asleep, and now he was calm awake. He was calm. And he is patient and kind. He answers their prayer by calming the wind, and he asks these questions: why are you fearful, and how is it that you have no faith? And in Luke 8, verse 25, it's the same story. There's only one question. So Mark has two questions: why are you fearful? How is it you have no faith? In Luke, it's only where is your faith? And if you think of it, it's the same. Because why are you fearful? When there is a lot of fear, there's no faith. It's the same question as where is your faith? So the way Mark puts it, he actually says the same question with different words. 2 times. But that is the core. Where is your faith? Jesus understands, and he sympathizes with the feelings of the disciples. And why is that so? Because he was a man. He was a man. He was a human. He had also human feelings. We can see that from this story. Because what was he doing? He was sleeping. Why? Because he was tired. He had labored and there was more to come. He was tired. And it says even when they take him aboard, back to Mark 4, in verse 36, it says, and they sent away the multitude and the disciples took Jesus, even as he was. You think, why is that? Well, because he was not really prepared. He was tired, probably hungry and all this. They just took him as he was, and they went. And so it makes sense that Jesus right away lay down on a pillow and he fell asleep. He was tired. And maybe that also gave the disciples some hesitance to wake him up, because they knew he was tired and they didn't want to bother him. But yeah, now it was really a difficult thing. So Jesus was tired, but at the same time he was resting in the midst of this storm. The ship was being pounded by the waves, and it was moving up and down and left and right, and he was sleeping. How can this be? Well, obviously he was not afraid, and he had casted all himself in his Father's care, I should say. He trusted that the Father would care of him, and this is what we see if we look at Jesus, the Son of Man. We see throughout all the Gospels this continuous, perfect relationship with the Father. And this is an example to us, it's meant as an example to us. If this is there, then you can trust the Father takes care. He takes care. This is what Jesus trusted, and he could sleep like a baby. Jesus, the man, was sleeping. God, the Father, was not sleeping. Actually, in Psalm 121, and let's go there, it's a beautiful psalm, it says, he never slumbers nor sleeps. And Jesus knew this. Father is watching over me. He will take care. His faith was strong. And this is a beautiful example of how we can behave even in the most dire storm that happens in our life. Psalm 121. I will lift up my eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve thee from all evil. He shall preserve thy soul. The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth, and even forevermore. It's a beautiful psalm. It's very encouraging, and this is what Jesus must have felt, and this is why he could sleep. Think of yourself, and I can speak also for myself. How many sleepless nights have we not had in our lives? Sleepless hours, restless nights, thinking about all the things that can happen and often never happen, but we worry about them anyway. While we, just like Jesus, can take a pillow, and in the midst of the storm we can just sleep. God will care. He is our keeper. He does not slumber nor sleep, and he shall preserve your soul. We see an example of this also in King David. I had to think of this also, and we talked about it long ago. In Psalm 3, this is a time when things were very bad for David. The time when he wrote this psalm, and he had many reasons to not be able to sleep. This is after he had killed his neighbor Uriah. And he had then committed adultery with his wife, his widow. He was a disgrace in his family because of this. He was basically guilty of murder. And then his son Absalom was trying to commit a coup and after his life. So it was a very bad situation. And so he was fleeing. But what does he write? In verse 1 there, he says, Lord, how they increased that trouble me. There are many that rise up against me. So everything is against him. Himself is against himself as well because of what he did, of course. And then, okay, many will say there is no help for him in God, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter of my head. And then in verse 5 he says, I laid me down and slept. He didn't lay down and worry and being scared and restless. He said, I lay me down and slept, and I awaked. That's in the morning, obviously, for the Lord sustained me. It means he didn't die in his sleep. He wasn't overtaken by his enemies. He could sleep in peace and rest and wake up. And he says then, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Okay, and it continues. So this is another example of when you really feel secure in the Lord, you can sleep in peace. So that is part of the lesson that Jesus is teaching here to his disciples and to us, that if we are really his followers, as his disciples were, then we can also trust that the Lord takes care of us, even in the most dire storm. Now there is another reason why Jesus asked them, where is your faith? Because what had he said before they went in the ship? Back to Mark 4, verse 35. The same day when the even was come, he said unto them, let us pass over unto the other side. He didn't say, let us go in the ship and drown on the lake. He said, let us go to the other side. That's what he said. And his disciples were his followers. So if Jesus was going to the other side and they were in the same boat, they would also get to the other side and nowhere else. And so it sounds maybe a bit silly, but think of this. This is when you are a follower of Jesus, you go where he goes. And where you go, he has gone before. Because you follow, obviously, in his footsteps, so to speak. So, if we are full of fear and doubts and worries, then one question we can ask ourselves is, are we actually going with Jesus? And if so, where are we going with Jesus? Where does he want me to go? Does he want me really to drown in all this misery? Or does he have a plan to bring me to the other side of the lake? Or to the green pasture, as for example in Psalm 23, when he is likened to the shepherd, and he might lead us even through the valley of the shadow of death. But after that there will be green pasture, he knows. For us it may seem only gloom and doom. So it's very interesting. This is what he says, let us pass over unto the other side. That is where they were going, and nowhere else. In John 12, verse 26, Jesus makes clear also this point. Because this does not apply just to anyone. This applies to his disciples. There were his disciples with him in the boat, not the multitude that stayed on shore. It is his followers. And so he says there in John 12, verse 26, if any man serve me, let him follow me. And where I am, there shall also my servant be. In this case, the other side of the lake. But the thing here is, the first part, if any man serve me, let him follow me. There is one condition and there are two verbs. The condition, if, begins with if. Many times Jesus says things and begins with if. And we have to pay attention there because usually we forget and we think this applies to anyone. But maybe we do not meet the conditions. If any man serve me. So, if you serve Jesus, you are his servant. That means he's your master. If that is so, then follow him. It makes perfect sense if you think of it, but often people call themselves Christians, which would imply they follow Jesus, but they don't. They follow their own hearts, they follow their own desires, etc., etc. And others, they don't follow Jesus at all, but they do all kinds of works. They think they are serving, but actually it's also leads nowhere. So, if any man serve me, let him follow me. And fear, doubt, worries, they will never take you off track. You're following Jesus. What can go wrong? Nothing. Nothing. Another strong example of a man who acts in such faith is Joshua. In Joshua 14, verse 8. Nevertheless, my brethren that went up with me, Joshua speaking here, made the heart of the people melt. They made the people afraid with their stories about the giants in the land. But I wholly followed the Lord my God. Joshua 14, verse 8. So, it's only Joshua and Caleb that entered the land from the most modest estimate of 2 million people. 2. It's 1 in a million, and probably there were more than 2 million. There were maybe up to 6 million people. It's very sobering. But why? Because he said, I followed my God, the Lord my God. It was his God he was following. The same David says when he approaches, before he approaches Goliath, he says, why do you allow this uncircumcised Philistine to blaspheme my God? And this is how we should feel. He is our Lord, our Master. He's our Shepherd. I have in my Bible, somewhere in the middle, a little note. For many years I came across this saying somewhere, I don't remember where, but I wrote it down and it's in there. And it says, you can tell the size of your God by looking at the size of your worry list. The longer the list, the smaller the God, your God. And that is there's truth in there. And worrying and being afraid, being fearful, it's a very bad thing. It's a very bad thing. It diminishes your faith and it discourages you, and you allow the enemy to attack you because you give him all kinds of hooks, opportunities to feed. He will feed this fear. He will make things happen that which he can say, see, you have a good reason to be afraid. Things are going wrong, and you will even get more into this. It's very depressing, actually. Now, again, there is a difference. The error that the disciples made when they saw Jesus so calm, they thought he didn't care. Why don't you care that we perish? It's the same with worrying or being afraid. Not worrying is not the same as not caring. We can care deeply about sorrow, about sickness of ourselves or of others. We can care deeply, but it doesn't mean that we are afraid or we worry. That's a different thing. So we shouldn't mix these two things up. The fact that we care means that we pray to God to resolve the situation or to give us strength to get through it. So that is a different thing, of course. But the disciples got a great lesson here, and so it's a great lesson for us. And I was just thinking, again, a bit silly maybe, but what should the disciples have done in a perfect situation? When they saw Jesus sleeping on a pillow in the storm, they should have gotten also a pillow and also lay down and let's sleep. It's the total opposite of what you would humanly ever do. But when disaster strikes, sickness or other things, that's actually what we can do. Just like David writes in Psalm 3. All these enemies and all this misery that is upon him and the shame that he had. But he says, I lay down and I slept. And by the way, he didn't have a bed. He was sleeping on a rock. I lay down and slept, and in the morning I woke up. And you watched over me. that is how we should also be. And I know it's the perfect situation. We are human beings. Fear will hit us from time to time, but these are the things that we can think of. We can trust Him, we can sleep in peace, even when the waves are over our head. Amen.